So if we talk about tax on transfers, so obviously transfer duty is something that I think most of our viewers know. But if you have transfer duty and VAT, because some property, some sales carry a VAT component, when do you pay VAT? When do you pay transfer duty? And even more importantly, say for instance, the purchaser is going to buy this property to use it as an Airbnb, and that entity will be VAT registered and will be a VAT entity, but the seller is not a VAT entity. So now we can't sell it as a going concern. Do you then pay tax, transfer duty, or do you pay VAT? What is the form of tax that you're going to pay in a transaction like that?
Sure. So, so transfer and sale of immovable property, especially, so this is outside the normal conveyancing realm, because now we need to start looking at the tax implications when a person wants to sell a property. So there's a couple of ways that we deal with property transactions. So there's a normal run-of-the-mill A sells to B, or Bruno sells to Cilna. Let's use relatable examples. So Bruno sells to Cilna. So B2C, exactly. So B sells the property to C. Simple as that. C buys the property and life goes on. You typically find this in residential properties, especially where people are living on the property. So first-time buyers, someone wants to live in the house I'm selling it. Alternatively, someone wants to rent the house out. But remember, when you supply accommodation, your typical long-term accommodation, you don't have to charge VAT on it. So even if your turnover is above the threshold, you don't have to levy VAT. It's only when it becomes starts bordering on commercial that you need to register for VAT. So as an example, and that's where Cilna's question becomes relevant. As an Airbnb, you'd have to register as a VAT vendor. So that's actually one of the first questions people used to ask is, oh, but why? It's both accommodation. It's different types of accommodation. So under the VAT Act, normal long-term residential housing is not, it's not a taxable supply. But Airbnb, guest houses, hotels, that sort of thing is a taxable supply, right? And so that's step one that we already need to understand. Depending on Cilna's use of the property would depend on whether she'd have to register for VAT or not. So your typical residential, you're good. Most commercial properties, if you sell and it's part of the enterprise, it would probably be a VAT transaction. So that's rule of thumb. Now, if you're buying, now say Cilna, for example, is buying a property from me, and I'm a VAT vendor, and she's a VAT vendor, and this property is part of my enterprise, and it's going to be part of her enterprise, and we're both VAT vendors. So I have an Airbnb, I now sell the property to Cilna, I'm VAT registered, she's VAT registered. We can zero rate the transaction. All that basically means is SARS went, sure, guys, we're not going to now make this effort where you're going to charge VAT and then you're going to pay it and then that person's just going to claim it back. Because remember, VAT is one of those things that the end user typically pays. So amongst business people, when we move certain supplies across the chain of supply, the supply chain, we don't pay VAT on those transactions until it hits the end user. So who's going to pay the VAT? It's going to be the person sleeping at the property. So when Cilna rents the property out to D, then yes, that person would pay Cilna VAT, and Cilna would pay that VAT through to SARS. But between us, we wouldn't need to do that. So we zero rate, and we zero rate because if I had to charge her VAT, I'd pay it, but then she would just claim that back as an input. So it wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense, right? So the third example, and this is where the complicated example comes in. If I am not a VAT vendor, and I have a property, and I don't need to be a VAT vendor. I was renting it out to a random person, and Cilna wants to buy it now, and she wants to run it as an Airbnb, but she needs to register for VAT. Say, for example, she hits that threshold, or a lot of people want to register for VAT because there's a lot of expenses that they're going to incur. And in Cilna's instance, for example, she's actually buying the property, so that's an expense. So what happens then? So Cilna now registers for VAT. It's this property. It's part of her enterprise. What can she do? So that people understand, especially within this context of any commercial property or Airbnb, Cilna is entitled to claim what's called notional input tax. So that's basically to say, look, we know that you bought a property. We know that that person isn't VAT registered. We know that you paid transfer duty, because now Cilna would have to pay transfer duty for this transaction between me and her. So she would probably want to know, how would she claim that back? Because that almost feels like she'd be entitled to claim that back the same way she would VAT. And the law does allow for that to happen. So it's called notional input tax. So she's allowed to claim it back. And it's calculated basically at the VAT rate of the lesser between the market value or what she paid for it. So that's just an interesting little thing that a lot of people don't consider when buying properties, is you need to see what the seller's using it for, but also consider what you're going to use it for, because it could actually be considered almost a taxable supply that you can claim VAT back on. So yeah, I think that answers that.
It does answer it. And if you explain tax stuff to me and I'm like, I actually get it, it means you're really doing it very well. Thank you, Bruno.
Oh, wow, thank you, yes.
No, really. Tax and I are like, what is this? I am not a fan of tax. Luckily, I surround myself with quite a few people that understand tax, but you really clearly understand it very, very, very well. Thanks, Bruno.